My name is Patricia Jones. I'm 41 years old, and the night my father died, his wife had already scheduled a locksmith. I found that out later, but I want to start there anyway, because that's the part that tells you everything you need to know about the woman my father married. He passed at 11:40 on a Tuesday night in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and the last of the flowers I'd brought him that morning. I was the one holding his hand when the monitor flatlined, not her. She had left 2 hours earlier because she said she couldn't watch it happen, and I understood that, I really did, until I learned what she was doing instead of sitting with her grief. By the time I got back to the house that same night, to get a change of clothes, and to breathe somewhere that wasn't a hospital corridor, there was a business card wedged under the front door. Ace lock and key, appointment scheduled for 9 a.m. the next morning. My father hadn't been gone for 6 hours yet. I stood on that porch in the dark, holding that card in my hand, and I felt something settle in me that I can only describe as clarity. Not sadness. Not yet. That came later in waves I couldn't always predict. What I felt standing there was recognition, the kind you get when a pattern you've been watching your whole life finally completes itself in front of you. I am a forensic accountant. That is the actual job I have built my entire adult life around, finding the places where numbers don't match the story people are telling. I spend my days reading balance sheets the way other people read faces, looking for the gap between what someone claims and what actually happened. And standing on my father's porch with a locksmith's card in my hand, I understood that my stepmother, Denise, had just handed me the first piece of evidence in a case I didn't yet know I'd be building. I want to be clear about something before I go any further, because I know how this sounds. I am not a vindictive person. I have spent 22 years being the quiet one, the one who didn't make waves, the one who let things go, because making a scene never once got me anywhere in that house. I learned that lesson early, and I learned it well. So when I tell you that 6 weeks after that locksmith's card appeared, I sat in a lawyer's conference room and set a folder down next to my stepmother's water glass, I need you to understand that I did not do it out of spite. I did it because for 22 years, Denise had built her entire understanding of who I was on a foundation of assumptions she never once bothered to check. She assumed I was still the same quiet girl from the family photographs, the one standing slightly off to the side, easy to overlook, easy to write off. She had absolutely no idea who I actually was by the time my father died, and that folder was the moment she found out. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, welcome back. If you've been with me a while, I tell stories like this one because I think a lot of us have lived some version of it. Maybe you weren't kicked out of a house the night a parent died, but maybe you know what it's like to be underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best. Maybe you know what it's like to sit quietly at a table where somebody else always got the bigger portion, the warmer welcome, the benefit of the doubt you never got. If any part of that sounds familiar, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because I read every single one, and I promise you, by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why staying quiet was the smartest thing I ever did. Before I take you back to where all of this actually started, let me finish telling you about that night, because I think the details matter. I didn't confront Denise on the porch. I didn't call her screaming about a locksmith's card at midnight while my father's body was still warm. I put the card in my coat pocket. I let myself into the house with the key I'd had since I was 9 years old, and I packed a single bag of clothes I hadn't touched in months because I hadn't been staying there anyway. Not really. Not for years. Denise was already asleep, or pretending to be, behind the door of the bedroom she'd shared with my father for the better part of 2 decades. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, looking at the family photographs on the wall, the ones where my stepsister Whitney was always front and center, gap-toothed and grinning, and I was always half a step behind someone's shoulder, present but not quite seen. I left the house that night without waking her, and I drove back to my own apartment 2 hours away, the one she didn't know existed, in the city she'd never once asked me about in 22 years. I sat in my car in the parking garage, underneath my building, and I let myself cry for the first time since the hospital, not because of the locksmith, not because of the eviction I knew was coming, but because my father was gone, and somewhere underneath all the strategy I was already starting to build in my head, that was the only thing that actually mattered. I gave myself exactly that one night to grieve as a daughter. Starting the next morning, I would have to start thinking like the only person in that family who'd ever bothered to learn how money, truth, and patience actually work together. Because here's the thing, nobody in my family understood about me. Not my father, God rest him, though I think somewhere deep down he suspected, and certainly not Denise or Whitney, who saw exactly what they wanted to see whenever they looked at me. I wasn't just some quiet accountant pushing paper in a back office somewhere. I had spent 2 decades building something real, something substantial, something that had my name on the deed in a city where nobody from that house had ever thought to look. Denise assumed that when my father died, she'd be managing a modest estate and a stepdaughter, easy enough to push out of the way with a change of the locks. She had no idea that the woman she was locking out owned a commercial building worth more than every single house on her street combined, and she was about to find that out in the most public, most undeniable way possible. Sitting at a conference table with a lawyer reading a will she thought she already understood completely. That morning was still weeks away from me on the night I'm describing, but I want you to sit with this image for a moment, because it's the one I keep coming back to whenever I tell this story. A locksmith's card under a door. A daughter standing in the dark with a key that still worked, walking through a house full of photographs where she was never quite in the center of the frame, saying goodbye to her father's home for what she believed at the time might be the very last time. She had no idea who I was. That's not just a line I use to describe what happened. That's the exact, precise truth of it, and by the time this story is over, you're going to understand exactly how much that ignorance was going to cost her. To understand why I was standing on that porch feeling something closer to recognition than grief, you have to go back to the very beginning, long before Denise ever walked through our front door. I was born in a small house on Larkspur Avenue, to a father named Walter Jones and a mother named Carol, whom I lost when I was 7 years old. Carol Jones died of an aneurysm on an ordinary Thursday afternoon while she was folding laundry in the room next to mine, and I want to tell you that I remember every detail of that day, but the truth is, I only remember pieces. I remember the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I remember my father's voice on the phone, low and shaking, saying words I didn't understand yet. I remember that the house smelled like fabric softener for weeks afterwards, and I couldn't smell that particular scent for years without feeling my chest tighten. My father was not a wealthy man, but he was a steady one, and in the years after my mother died, it was just the two of us in that little house, learning how to be a family of 2 instead of 3. He worked as a supervisor at a regional distribution warehouse, the kind of job that paid enough to keep the lights on and put food on the table, but never enough to feel like there was room to breathe. What my father lacked in money, though, he made up for in a particular kind of quiet discipline that I didn't fully appreciate until I was much older. Every Sunday evening, without fail, he would sit at the kitchen table with a small notebook and go through our finances line by line, not because we had complicated finances, we didn't, but because he believed that paying close attention to something was the same as respecting it. I used to sit across from him doing my homework while he worked through those columns of numbers, and somewhere in that repetition, without either of us realizing it, he was teaching me the exact skill that would define the rest of my life. The person who really shaped how I understood money, though, wasn't my father directly. It was his father, my grandfather Elmer Jones, a man who had spent 40 years running a small hardware store before selling it and quietly investing the proceeds in a handful of commercial properties around town. Grandpa Elmer was not a flashy man. He drove the same truck for 15 years and wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, and most people who met him assumed he was exactly what he appeared to be, a retired hardware store owner living a modest, unremarkable life. What those people didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that Grandpa Elmer had built himself into a genuinely wealthy man through decades of patience, discipline, and a refusal to let anyone else's opinion of him dictate how he actually lived. Every other Saturday, my father would drop me off at Grandpa Elmer's place for the afternoon, and those Saturdays became the foundation of everything I would eventually build my own life on. Grandpa Elmer didn't believe in babysitting a child by putting her in front of a television. Instead, he would sit me down at his kitchen table with his own set of ledgers, the real ones, the ones that tracked the rent coming in from his properties and the maintenance costs going out, and he would explain to me, patiently, and without ever once talking down to me, how a piece of property could quietly generate income year after year, while everybody around you assumed you were just a man in flannel shirts with nothing much going on. He used to say that the people who make the most noise about what they have are usually the ones who have the least understanding of how to keep it, and that real wealth, the kind that lasts, is built by people who are comfortable being underestimated. I was maybe 9 or 10 years old the first time he told me that lesson directly, and I didn't understand it then the way I understand it now. We were sitting on his back porch, and I had asked him, with the blunt honesty only a child can manage, why he didn't buy a nicer truck if he had money in the bank the way my father said he did. He set down his coffee and looked at me for a long moment, and then he said something I have carried with me every single day since. He said that the moment you start spending money to convince other people you have it, you've already lost the plot, because the whole point of building something real is that it belongs to you and nobody else, and it doesn't need an audience to be worth having. I didn't fully grasp what he meant at the time, but I filed it away the way children do with things adults say that feel important even before they're understood. And over the years, that lesson slowly unpacked itself in my mind until it became one of the central truths I've built my entire life around. Grandpa Elmer passed away when I was 12, and in the years that followed, my father remarried, but I want to hold on to this part of the story a little longer before I take you there, because I think it matters that you understand who I was before Denise ever entered the picture. I was a serious child, maybe too serious for my age, the kind of kid who preferred a quiet afternoon with a book or a set of numbers to spending time playing outside with the other children on our street. I wasn't unhappy, not exactly, but I carried a particular kind of watchfulness with me even then, a habit of noticing details other people missed, of sitting quietly in a room and absorbing everything happening around me while giving away almost nothing about what I was actually thinking. Some of that came from losing my mother so young, and learning early that the world could shift under your feet without warning. But a lot of it, I think now, came from those Saturday afternoons with Grandpa Elmer, learning that the people who talk the least often understand the most, and that patience is not the same thing as weakness, no matter how many people confuse the two. My father did his best in those years, and I want to be fair to him, because this isn't a story about a father who failed me. Not entirely. Not in those early years anyway. He showed up to every school event he could manage around his work schedule. He learned how to braid my hair, badly at first, and then eventually with a kind of clumsy competence that I found endearing even as a teenager. He kept my mother's photographs up around the house, not in a way that felt like a shrine, but in a way that felt like he wanted me to grow up, knowing exactly where I came from and who had loved me before grief ever entered the picture. Those years, just the two of us in that small house on Larkspur Avenue, weren't easy, but they were honest. And looking back, I think that honesty is exactly what I lost the moment Denise walked through our front door with her daughter Whitney's hand in hers, smiling in a way that I would spend the next 22 years slowly learning not to trust. I didn't know it then, sitting at that kitchen table doing my homework while my father worked through his Sunday ledgers, or sitting on Grandpa Elmer's back porch listening to him explain why real wealth doesn't need an audience. But those quiet, unremarkable afternoons were building something in me that would take decades to fully mature. I was learning, piece by piece, without ever being told directly, that the people who underestimate you are handing you an advantage they don't even realize they're giving away. I was learning that silence isn't emptiness, it's often just patience wearing a different coat. And I was learning, most importantly of all, that the wisdom passed down to you by people who genuinely love you, whether it's a father working through a notebook every Sunday or a grandfather explaining rent ledgers to a 9-year-old on a back porch, is worth more than anything money alone could ever buy you. I just didn't know yet how much I was going to need every single one of those lessons, and how soon. My father met Denise Pruitt when I was 13 years old, a little more than a year after Grandpa Elmer passed away, at a point in our lives when I think my father was simply tired of being alone. I don't fault him for that. Grief is heavy, and carrying it by yourself for 6 years while raising a daughter and working long shifts at a warehouse would wear down a stronger man than most people give credit for. He met her at a community fundraiser at our church, and I remember the first time he brought her home for dinner, how she complimented everything in our house, the curtains, the casserole I had helped make, the way I set the table, in a voice so warm and so eager to please that I actually liked her at first. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell you I distrusted her from the very beginning, but that isn't true. I was 13 and lonely in my own way, and when Denise Pruitt smiled at me across our kitchen table that first night, I let myself hope that maybe our family was about to get a little bigger and a little less quiet. They married 8 months later in a small ceremony at the same church where they'd met, and Denise moved in along with her daughter Whitney, who was 2 years younger than me, and had a way of looking at a room that told you immediately she expected it to arrange itself around her. I don't say that to be cruel. Whitney wasn't a bad kid, not really. She was just a child who had been taught by her mother that certain things were simply owed to her, and children absorb those lessons the way sponges absorb water, without ever questioning whether the water is actually clean. For the first few months, things were genuinely fine. Denise redecorated the living room, which stung a little, because it meant packing away some of my mother's things, but she did it gently, boxing everything up carefully and telling me I could keep whatever I wanted in my own room, and at the time, I appreciated that she was at least trying. The shift happened slowly enough that I couldn't point to a single day and say, that's when everything changed. It was more like watching a tide come in, imperceptible from moment to moment, until you looked up one day and realized the whole shoreline looked different from what it used to. It started with small things. Whitney's school pickup always seemed to come first on the schedule, even on the days it should have been mine. Dinner conversations began revolving more and more around Whitney's day. Her friends, her latest interest in gymnastics or art class or whatever, had captured her attention that particular month, while my own updates about school or friends were met with a distracted nod before the conversation drifted back to my stepsister. My father, to his credit, tried at first to balance things, but Denise had a particular skill, one I would only fully understand and name years later in my professional life, for reallocating resources so gradually that nobody noticed the redistribution until it was already complete. The tutors came first for Whitney, not because she was struggling academically, but because Denise believed, or at least said she believed, that Whitney had a special gift for mathematics that needed nurturing. I remember sitting at that same kitchen table where my father used to work through his Sunday ledgers, now watching a tutor work through basic algebra with Whitney twice a week, while I did my own considerably more advanced coursework alone in my room, because nobody had thought to ask whether I might benefit from any additional support of my own. It wasn't that I needed the tutoring, I was doing perfectly fine on my own, but the message underneath the arrangement was impossible to miss, even for a 14-year-old. One daughter's education was worth investing in publicly, at the kitchen table, in full view of the family. The other daughter's education was simply expected to take care of itself. Then came the birthdays. My 15th birthday fell 3 weeks after Whitney's 13th, and I remember the exact contrast because it was the first time the pattern became undeniable enough that I couldn't explain it away anymore. Whitney's birthday that year was a full party, streamers and a rented bounce house in the backyard, a cake from the good bakery downtown with her name written in careful cursive icing, and a stack of presents that took up half the dining room table. My birthday, 3 weeks later, was dinner at home, a store-bought cake from the grocery store with generic lettering that didn't even have my name on it, and a single gift, a sweater 2 sizes too big that Denise assured me I would grow into. My father seemed to notice the disparity. I remember him looking uncomfortable at the dinner table that night, but he didn't say anything, and I understood even then that whatever peace existed in that house depended on nobody pointing out the things everybody could clearly see. The defining moment, though, the one I still think about more than any other from those years, happened when I was 16, at what was supposed to be a simple family photograph session for our annual holiday card. Denise had hired a photographer, an actual professional, to come to the house and capture what she called our beautiful blended family. And I remember standing in the living room in the outfit she'd picked out for me, a plain navy dress that didn't quite fit right, while Whitney wore a bright red dress that Denise had clearly spent real money on. The photographer arranged us for the first shot, and Denise stepped in, gently but firmly repositioning everyone, moving Whitney to the very center of the frame beside my father, moving Denise herself just beside them, and then guiding me, with a light hand on my shoulder and a smile that never once faltered, to stand just slightly behind and to the side, angled so that half my face would be turned away from the camera in the final print. I didn't say anything in the moment. I want you to understand that about me, because it's important for everything that comes later in this story. I stood exactly where I was placed, and I smiled for the photograph, and later that Christmas, when the cards went out to relatives and family friends, I saw myself in that image exactly the way Denise had arranged me, present, technically included, but positioned so that anyone glancing at the photo would understand instantly who the family actually centered around. My father sent me a look that Christmas, a brief, apologetic look across the room that told me he knew exactly what had happened and felt bad about it, but he never once said a word to Denise about it. Not that year, and not in any of the years that followed when the same arrangement repeated itself in card after card, photo after photo, a quiet visual record of exactly where I stood in that family's estimation. I want to be fair here, because fairness is something I value, even when I'm telling a story about people who were not fair to me. My father was not a cruel man, and I don't believe Denise ever set out with the deliberate intention of hurting me. I think, honestly, she simply loved her own daughter more easily than she loved her husband's, the way plenty of people do, and she never quite worked hard enough to correct for that instinct, the way a better person might have. But the effect on me, regardless of her intentions, was the same as if it had been deliberate. I learned, slowly and thoroughly over those years, that in that house, I was a guest who happened to have permanent residency, welcomed but never quite centered, tolerated but never quite celebrated. And somewhere in absorbing that lesson, without ever consciously deciding to, I started building a version of myself that existed entirely outside that house's approval. A version of myself that Denise would spend the next 2 decades completely failing to notice was growing right under her roof. I left home the week after I turned 18, not in a dramatic slammed door kind of way, but quietly, the same way I did most things in that house. I had been accepted to the state university 2 hours away, with a partial academic scholarship I'd earned entirely on my own, without any tutors, without any of the resources that had flowed so freely toward Whitney over the years, and I packed my car on a Saturday morning while Denise was out running errands and my father was at work. I left a note on the kitchen table, the same table where Grandpa Elmer's ledgers used to sit open in front of me, and I drove away from Larkspur Avenue with almost everything I owned in the back seat and a feeling in my chest that I can only describe as relief, mixed with a grief I wasn't ready to examine too closely yet. College is where I first discovered that the thing I had always been quietly good at, noticing patterns, sitting with numbers until they told me the truth about a situation, had an actual name and an actual profession attached to it. I declared accounting as my major in my second semester, mostly because it felt familiar in a way nothing else did, and by my junior year, a professor who taught a course in fraud examination pulled me aside after class one afternoon and told me I had an instinct for forensic work that she didn't see very often in students my age. She explained that forensic accounting wasn't just about balancing books, It was about finding the story hiding underneath the numbers, the gap between what people claimed had happened and what the evidence actually showed had happened. I remember sitting in her office that day, thinking about Grandpa Elmer's ledgers, about the way he taught me to read a property's true value instead of its surface appearance, and something clicked into place that felt less like learning a new skill and more like finally being given the right name for something I had always known how to do. I worked 2 jobs through most of college, waiting tables on weekends and doing data entry for a small local accounting firm during the week. And I want to be honest that those years were hard in a way that has nothing romantic about it. There were semesters where I ate ramen for 2 weeks straight to make rent, and nights where I sat in my tiny studio apartment doing homework by the light of a single desk lamp because I was trying to save money on my electric bill. But I never once called my father asking for financial help, and I want to explain why, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. It wasn't pride exactly, though there was some of that. It was that I had already learned, sitting at that kitchen table watching Whitney's tutors come and go, while my own needs went quietly unmet, that asking for help in that house came with an invisible cost I wasn't willing to keep paying. I decided somewhere in those early college years that I would rather build something slowly and entirely on my own than ever again put myself in a position where someone got to decide whether I was worth investing in. I graduated with honors and landed a junior position at a mid-sized accounting firm in the city, 2 hours from Larkspur Avenue, close enough that I could visit my father when I wanted to, but far enough that Denise's household had no real presence in my day-to-day life anymore. Those first few years in the city were where I truly started building, not just my career, but the private financial foundation that would eventually become the building Denise had absolutely no idea existed. I lived below my means in a way that would have seemed almost obsessive to most people my age, sharing an apartment with 2 roommates well into my late 20s, driving the same modest car for nearly a decade, putting away a percentage of every single paycheck into savings and investments before I ever let myself spend $1 on anything that wasn't strictly necessary. I remember one of my roommates asking me once, half joking, whether I was secretly a millionaire hiding it from everyone, and I laughed it off the way you do. But the honest answer, even then, was that I was building toward exactly that, one careful decision at a time. The real turning point came when I was 29, about 11 years after I'd left Larkspur Avenue for good. A commercial building came up for sale in a part of the city that most investors at the time considered unremarkable, a 3-story brick structure with retail space on the ground floor and office suites above, priced low because the neighborhood hadn't yet caught the attention of the developers who would eventually transform it. I had spent years by that point studying commercial real estate in my off hours, the way other people study a hobby, reading market reports, walking neighborhoods on weekends just to watch foot traffic patterns, running my own private financial models on buildings I had no intention of ever actually buying, purely because I wanted to understand the mechanics of it the way Grandpa Elmer had once tried to teach me on his back porch. When that building came up for sale, I recognized something in the numbers that most other buyers were missing, and I put in an offer using every dollar I had saved, plus a mortgage I had spent years positioning myself to qualify for on my own credit, without a single dollar of help from anyone in my family. I bought that building alone, closed on it alone, and told absolutely no one outside of my closest professional circle that I had done it. Not my father, not any distant relatives, and certainly not Denise or Whitney, who by that point I spoke to only a handful of times a year. At holidays, my father insisted on hosting jointly, brief, polite, forgettable conversations that never once touched on the actual shape of my life. I want to explain why I kept it hidden, because I think people sometimes assume secrecy like that comes from shame, and it was the opposite of that entirely. I kept it hidden because I had learned, slowly and painfully over 18 years in that house, that the moment you reveal what you actually have, people's behavior toward you changes in ways that are rarely for the better. I had watched Denise recalibrate her warmth toward my father over the years, based entirely on what he could provide, and I was not about to hand her a new reason to recalibrate her warmth toward me. Over the following decade, I quietly expanded what I had built. I refinanced strategically, brought on tenants I vetted personally, and eventually acquired a second, smaller property using the equity from the first, all while maintaining the same modest, unremarkable lifestyle I had always kept. I drove an older car. I lived in a comfortable but not extravagant apartment. When I visited my father, I dressed the way I always had, quietly and without any signal of the actual financial reality underneath. My father knew I was doing well. He knew I had a good job and owned some property, because those were the kinds of general updates you share with a parent even at a distance, but he never asked for exact numbers, and I never offered them, and I think in some strange way, that arrangement suited both of us. He got to feel proud of me in a general sense without the complication of specifics, and I got to keep the one part of my life that was entirely mine, entirely private, entirely outside the reach of a household that had spent 18 years teaching me exactly how much safer it was to be quietly underestimated than loudly seen. My father's decline started slowly, the way these things often do, with small signs that are easy to explain away until suddenly they aren't. It began about 3 years before he passed, when he started forgetting small things during our phone calls, repeating a story he'd already told me the week before, or asking about a work project I knew he'd retired from years earlier. I noticed it before Denise ever mentioned it to me, because I had spent my entire career learning to catch the small inconsistencies other people talk right past, and something about the rhythm of my father's speech had changed in a way that worried me long before anyone gave it a name. When the diagnosis finally came, a slow progressing cognitive decline that the doctors were careful not to call anything more frightening than they had to, I drove the 2 hours back to Larkspur Avenue more often than I had in years, and that is when I first truly understood how completely Denise had positioned herself as the gatekeeper to my father's life. It started with the phone calls. For years, I had been able to call the house directly and reach my father whenever I wanted, but somewhere in that first year after his diagnosis, Denise began answering every single call herself, telling me he was resting, or that he wasn't feeling up to talking, or that he'd already gone to bed, even when I knew for a fact it was only 7 in the evening. When I did get to speak with him, the calls felt supervised in a way I couldn't quite prove but could absolutely feel, short and strangely formal, as though Denise were standing close enough to hear every word and my father knew it. I began driving up unannounced on weekends instead of calling ahead, partly because I wanted to see him with my own eyes, and partly because I had started to suspect, in the careful, evidence-gathering part of my brain that never fully switches off, that something in that house was not what it appeared to be on the surface. What I found on those unannounced visits was a father who lit up genuinely every single time he saw me, who would grip my hand a little too tightly and ask me to stay just a little longer, but who also seemed diminished in ways that went beyond his diagnosis. He had lost weight. The house, once kept in reasonably good order, had grown quietly shabbier around him, paint peeling in places that would have bothered him deeply in his healthier years, small repairs left undone that I knew he would have handled himself if he still had the capacity and the encouragement to do so. Meanwhile, I noticed new furniture in the living room, a car in the driveway I didn't recognize that turned out to belong to Whitney, who Denise explained was going through a rough patch and needed somewhere to stay for a while, a rough patch that, as far as I could tell, lasted the better part of 2 years, and involved absolutely no contribution toward the household expenses that my father was still, somehow, expected to cover. I want to be careful here, because I know how easy it is to make a story like this sound simpler than it actually was. My father was not being physically abused or starved or neglected in any way I could point to directly and call cruelty. What I was watching instead was something quieter and, in its own way, harder to fight. A slow redirection of resources and attention away from a man who could no longer clearly advocate for himself, and toward the 2 people in that house who had never once needed to. I started keeping notes, actual written records, dates and observations, not because I had decided yet to do anything with them, but because it is simply how my mind works. I cannot walk past an inconsistency without documenting it, and by that point in my life, I had spent almost 2 decades training myself professionally to notice exactly the kind of quiet financial erosion I was watching happen in real time inside my own father's house. The visit that changed everything happened about 8 months before he passed, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon when I arrived unannounced, the way I usually did by then, and found my father sitting alone at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of him that he clearly did not fully understand. Denise was out, Whitney was out, and my father, in one of his clearer moments, one of those windows of lucidity that his condition still allowed him from time to time, looked up at me with something like relief on his face and said he was glad I had come because he needed help understanding what he was being asked to sign. I sat down across from him at that same table where he used to work through his Sunday ledgers so many years earlier, and I looked through the papers with him, and what I found made my stomach turn in a way that very few things in my professional career ever have. It was a power of attorney document, drafted by a lawyer I had never heard of, granting Denise full authority over my father's financial affairs, and beside it, a set of account statements showing withdrawals over the previous year that did not remotely match my father's known spending habits or needs. I asked him gently, the way you learn to ask someone whose memory can no longer always be trusted, whether he remembered signing anything like this before, and he said no, he didn't think so, though his voice carried the particular uncertainty of a man who genuinely could not be sure anymore what he had and hadn't agreed to. I photographed every page of those documents that afternoon, before Denise returned home, not because I had decided in that moment to build a case against her, but because 20 years of professional instinct told me that whatever was happening in that house needed to be recorded before it could be quietly explained away or made to disappear. I didn't confront Denise that day, and I didn't tell my father what I suspected, because I didn't yet have enough to be certain, and because I understood that accusing her without proof would only give her the chance to cover her tracks more carefully. What I did instead was quietly retain an attorney of my own, a woman named Roberta Chen who specialized in elder financial matters, and I began, slowly and methodically, the exact kind of patient investigation I had spent my entire career learning how to conduct. This time turned toward the family that had spent 18 years teaching me how little I mattered. Over the following months, as my father's condition worsened and my visits grew more frequent, I quietly built a file, bank records I was legally able to access as his biological daughter, copies of documents I photographed on visits when I could, notes on conversations, dates and details, all of it assembled with the same careful, unemotional precision I brought to every fraud case I had ever worked professionally. Except this time, the numbers I was following led directly back to the house where I grew up, and to the woman who was about to discover, far too late, exactly who she had been underestimating all along. The file Roberta and I built over those final months told a story that was worse than I had let myself imagine that first afternoon at the kitchen table. The power of attorney had been signed 6 weeks after my father's diagnosis, during a period his own doctor's notes described as a time of significant cognitive fluctuation, and the withdrawals that followed painted a picture that any forensic accountant would recognize immediately. Small amounts at first, a few $100s here and there that could be explained away as household expenses, and then larger transfers, a home equity line drawn against the house my father had paid off entirely 15 years earlier, money moved into an account that Roberta's investigator traced back to a car dealership, a timeshare company, and a payment plan for what turned out to be Whitney's outstanding credit card debt from a business venture that had collapsed 2 years prior. My father, a man who had spent his entire life keeping careful ledgers at that kitchen table, was quietly financing his stepdaughter's failures while losing the ability to understand what was happening to his own money. Roberta was the one who first raised the possibility of undue influence, a legal term I had encountered in my professional life but never expected to hear applied to my own family, and she explained that with the documentation we had, the timing of the diagnosis, the timing of the signature, and the pattern of withdrawals that benefited Denise and Whitney almost exclusively, we had grounds to challenge the power of attorney and potentially any will that had been drafted or amended during that same window. That was the moment I learned something that changed the entire shape of what was coming. Because when Roberta pulled the county records to check on the house title itself, she discovered that my father had done something I never knew about, something that had happened long before Denise ever entered our lives. It turned out that Grandpa Elmer, in the final years before he passed, had established a small family trust, modest by most standards, but significant, given how quietly it had been built, funded initially by proceeds from 2 of the commercial properties that he had sold before his death, rather than passing directly through his estate. The trust had been drafted with my father as the initial trustee and named a single beneficiary upon my father's death, a beneficiary who was not Denise, not Whitney, but me, specifically naming Patricia Jones, granddaughter, in language that made clear Grandpa Elmer had structured it that way on purpose, years before he ever could have known Denise would exist in our lives at all. The house on Larkspur Avenue itself, it turned out, had never been solely in my father's name, the way Denise had always assumed. It sat on a small parcel that Grandpa Elmer had originally purchased and folded into that same trust structure decades earlier, a detail buried in county records that nobody in that house had ever thought to check, because why would they, when the story everyone believed was so much simpler than the truth actually was? I sat in Roberta's office the day she explained all of this to me, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was less triumph than a kind of quiet, aching gratitude toward 2 men who were both gone now, my father and my grandfather, who had each in their own way, without ever fully saying it out loud to me, made sure that no matter what happened in that house, no matter who else came and went and rearranged the family photographs and redirected the tutors and the birthday parties, there was a foundation underneath all of it that belonged to me and could not simply be taken away by someone who had spent 22 years assuming I didn't matter enough to protect. Grandpa Elmer's lesson on that back porch all those years ago, about wealth that doesn't need an audience, about building something real instead of something loud, had apparently extended 1 generation further than I ever realized, all the way down into a trust document, sitting quietly in a filing cabinet that Denise never once thought to look for, because she never imagined there was anything there worth finding. The power of attorney complicated things legally, and Roberta was careful to explain that we would need to move deliberately, rather than emotionally, because a fight over my father's capacity while he was still alive risked becoming ugly and public in ways that could hurt him during whatever time he had left. So we made a decision together, one that I want to be honest was difficult for me, which was to let the immediate financial situation continue under careful observation rather than confronting Denise directly, while my father was still fighting for whatever quality of life remained to him. I could not undo what had already been taken, not without a legal battle that would have consumed his final months in depositions and court filings, and I was not willing to spend the last chapter of my father's life fighting his wife in a courtroom instead of sitting with him in whatever peace we could still find together. What I could do, and what Roberta and I spent those final months quietly preparing, was make certain that the moment my father passed, the trust would activate exactly as Grandpa Elmer had designed it to, and that Denise would have no legal ability whatsoever to touch the house, the land underneath it, or anything else that had been protected inside that structure decades before she ever arrived. I never told my father directly what I had discovered, though I sometimes wonder now, in the quiet moments since he passed, whether some part of him already knew, whether the reason he had looked up at me that Sunday afternoon with something like relief in his eyes was because some instinct in him, even through the fog of his condition, understood that I was the one person in that house who would actually protect what needed protecting. I did tell him, in one of our last real conversations, sitting beside his hospital bed, near the very end, that he didn't need to worry about anything, that everything was going to be handled exactly the way it should be, and he squeezed my hand and said something that I have held on to every single day since, that he always knew I would be the one who understood the numbers, and that his father, my grandfather, had told him the same thing about me years before I ever believed it myself. That was as close as my father ever came to telling me what he and Grandpa Elmer had quietly built for me, and it was enough, because by the time Denise put that locksmith's card under the door 6 hours after he died, I already knew something she didn't. I knew exactly what that house actually was, and exactly who it actually belonged to, and I knew that the eviction she thought she was carrying out that night was, legally and undeniably, nothing more than her own quiet, unknowing act of trespassing on property that had never been hers to control in the first place. The will reading was scheduled for 6 weeks after the funeral, at Roberta's request, in a conference room at her office rather than at the house, a small detail that I later realized mattered a great deal, because it meant Denise walked in expecting the same kind of controlled environment she had always managed to create for herself, and instead found herself sitting at a table where she held none of the advantages she was used to having. I arrived early, the way I always do, and I sat at the far end of the table with a single manila folder in front of me, closed, unremarkable, the kind of folder that could have held anything or nothing at all. Denise arrived 15 minutes later with Whitney beside her, both of them dressed the way you dress when you believe you are about to be handed good news. Denise in a cream-colored blazer I recognized as new, Whitney checking her phone with the particular restlessness of someone who has already decided how she plans to spend money she doesn't have yet. Denise greeted me warmly when she walked in, the same warmth she had offered across our kitchen table 28 years earlier, and I let her have that warmth without pushing back against it, because I had learned a long time ago that there is no strategic value in showing your hand before the moment calls for it. She asked how I was holding up, whether I had found a place to stay, and there was something almost maternal in the way she said it, as though the locksmith's card had never happened, as though she hadn't already changed the locks on a house that legally was never hers to secure in the first place. I told her I was managing, which was true, and I watched her settle into her seat with the particular ease of a woman who believes she already knows exactly how this meeting is going to unfold. Roberta began, as she always does, with the formalities, confirming everyone's identity for the record, explaining the structure of the reading, and I watched Denise's posture shift slightly, that careful straightening of the spine that people do when they sense money is about to be discussed and want to make sure they look composed when it happens. Roberta read through the initial provisions of my father's actual will first, small personal items, a modest life insurance policy that had been in place for years, and then she paused and said that before addressing the remaining provisions, there was a separate matter that needed to be brought into the room, a family trust established by my grandfather, Elmer Jones, decades earlier, that predated and superseded certain assumptions about the ownership of the property on Larkspur Avenue. I watched Denise's face very carefully in that moment, because 22 years of studying that particular face across dinner tables and holiday photographs had taught me exactly what her confusion looked like before it hardened into something else. She asked, politely at first, what trust Roberta was referring to, because as far as she understood, the house had belonged to my father outright, and she had been living in it, managing it, as his wife for over 2 decades. Roberta explained, in the calm, unhurried voice she uses for exactly these moments, that the land and structure had in fact been held inside a trust since before my father's second marriage, that my father had served as trustee during his lifetime, and that upon his death, the sole named beneficiary of that trust, specified in the original documents drafted by my grandfather, was me. The room went quiet in a particular way that I have only ever experienced a handful of times in my professional life. The specific silence that follows the exact moment someone realizes the story they believed in for years was never actually true. Denise's mouth opened slightly before any words came out, and when they finally did, they came out smaller than I expected, almost a whisper, asking whether that meant the house. I let Roberta answer that question rather than answering it myself, because I wanted the truth to arrive from a neutral, professional source, rather than from me, and Roberta confirmed, plainly and without unnecessary cruelty, that yes, the house on Larkspur Avenue, along with the parcel of land it sat on, belonged legally and entirely to me, and had never at any point belonged to my father in the way Denise had always assumed. That was when I opened the folder in front of me, because I had decided, sitting in that hospital hallway all those months earlier, that if this moment ever came, I would not let Denise's shock stand alone without context. Inside the folder were copies of the power of attorney document, signed 6 weeks after my father's diagnosis, the bank statements showing the withdrawals that traced back to Whitney's debts, and a timeshare Denise had purchased without my father's informed knowledge, and a summary letter from Roberta, outlining the grounds we had already prepared, quietly, over the preceding months, to challenge every single one of those transactions as products of undue influence exercised over a man who could no longer fully protect himself. I slid the folder across the table, and I said, in the same calm voice I use when I present findings to a client at the end of a long audit, that I had hoped it would not come to this, but that I needed her to understand I had known for some time exactly what had been happening in that house, and exactly what it would take to undo it. Whitney was the one who broke first, not Denise, standing up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor, asking what any of this had to do with her, and I watched Denise's hand shoot out and grip her daughter's wrist, a silencing gesture I had seen 100 times over the years, except this time, it did nothing to stop what was already unfolding. Denise looked at me across that table, and for one brief moment, I saw something in her face that I had never once seen in 22 years. Not confidence, not warmth, not the careful management of appearances she had always relied on, but genuine, unguarded fear, the fear of a woman realizing all at once that the quiet stepdaughter she had spent 2 decades positioning at the edge of every family photograph had, without her ever once noticing, become the only person in that room who actually held any real power at all. What happened in the weeks after that? Well, reading unfolded exactly the way Roberta had prepared me for, methodically and without drama, because that is simply how these things move, once the paperwork is solid and the other side has no real ground left to stand on. Denise's attorney, a man she hired in a hurry, the day after the reading, sent a letter attempting to argue that the trust itself should be contested, but Roberta had anticipated exactly that move months earlier, and the original documents Grandpa Elmer had drafted, decades before Denise ever entered our lives, were airtight in a way that left her attorney very little room to maneuver. Within 6 weeks, Denise's lawyer quietly withdrew the challenge, and not long after that, facing the very real threat of a formal undue influence lawsuit over the withdrawals and the power of attorney, Denise agreed, through her attorney, to a settlement that returned every dollar that had been drained from my father's accounts during those final 2 years. Funds that I directed, once they came back, into a scholarship fund at the community college near Larkspur Avenue, set up quietly in my father's name, for students studying accounting and finance who came from households without the resources to pay for tutors or private lessons of their own. Denise moved out of the house within 2 months, into a smaller rental across town, and I did not gloat over that, and I want to be clear about that, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as a triumphant eviction, the daughter finally throwing out the stepmother who once threw her out, but that is not how it felt to me at all when it actually happened. What I felt instead, standing in that empty house a few weeks later, walking through rooms that still smelled faintly of my father even months after he was gone, was something closer to a long, slow exhale, the release of a tension I had been carrying since I was 13 years old, and first understood that I would always be the daughter standing slightly outside the frame. Whitney and I have not spoken since that day in the conference room, and I have made my peace with that, because some relationships end not with a dramatic confrontation, but simply with the quiet recognition that they were never built on anything real to begin with. I kept the house on Larkspur Avenue rather than selling it, and I want to tell you why, because I think it matters. I did not keep it out of spite, or to prove a point to anyone who might drive past it and wonder what happened to the family that used to live there. I kept it because it sat on land my grandfather bought with his own 2 hands, decades before anyone in that family ever doubted what I was capable of, and because somewhere underneath all the years of tutors and birthday parties and photographs where I stood half turned away from the camera, that house was the one place my mother's memory had also once lived, briefly, before grief and remarriage rearranged everything around it. I renovated it slowly over the following year, and I moved in myself, not because I needed the space. My building in the city was worth considerably more, but because I wanted, for the first time in my adult life, to occupy that kitchen table as the person who actually got to decide who belonged there and who didn't. My father's decline taught me things about grief and patience that I don't think I could have learned any other way, and I have come to believe, in the time since, that the years I spent quietly building my career, and my property, and my private, unshared life were not simply a response to being overlooked. They were, in a strange and roundabout way, the truest expression of everything Grandpa Elmer tried to teach me on that back porch when I was 9 years old. That wealth built quietly, without an audience, without the need for anyone else's validation, is the only kind that actually holds up when the people around you finally show you who they really are. Denise spent 22 years managing appearances, managing photographs, managing which daughter sat where at which table, and in the end, all of that management amounted to nothing, because she had built her entire understanding of the world on the assumption that the quiet ones simply don't matter as much, and she was never once forced to reconsider that assumption until it was already far too late for her to do anything about it. I think about that locksmith's card sometimes, still tucked away in a drawer in my study, not as a trophy exactly, but as a kind of reminder to myself of how close I came to letting that single night define the rest of the story. It would have been easy, in the raw grief of losing my father, to let that eviction be the final word, to let Denise's cruelty in that moment be the last thing I remembered about that house and everything it once meant to me. Instead, I let it become the beginning of something else entirely, the moment I finally understood that everything I had quietly built over 2 decades, every dollar saved instead of spent, every skill sharpened instead of shown off, every piece of wisdom my father and my grandfather had passed down to me without ever making a show of it, had prepared me for exactly this, a moment I never wanted but was, in the end, more than ready for. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Your silence is not weakness, not when it is chosen deliberately and used with patience, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has already done all the math while everyone else was still busy performing for an audience that was never really watching. True wealth, the kind that actually lasts, is built through discipline and patience, and the wisdom passed down by people who love you enough to protect you, even when you don't yet know you need protecting. And it very rarely announces itself the way people expect it to. And the people who dismiss you, who position you at the edge of the family photograph, who assume the quiet ones simply don't count for as much, will always underestimate you, right up until the moment they can't anymore. And by then, that mistake belongs entirely to them, not to you. If this story meant something to you, if you have ever been the one standing just outside the frame, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and if you haven't already, subscribe, because there are more stories like mine still waiting to be told.